Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I discovered it the week my parents claimed that money was too tight for me to ask for anything extra, and then, almost in the same breath, they announced that my brother had been surprised with a Mediterranean cruise because, in their words, he deserved to relax. I remember sitting at that table with my coffee cooling in front of me, nodding as if it was perfectly normal, but inside I felt something snap that had been stretched thin for years. I did not argue, I did not whine, I did not even ask the obvious question about how money could be tight in one direction and flowing in another, because for once I wanted to watch their story play out without me feeding it. When the door closed and I was alone again, I pulled up my banking app. I had always known I was the one covering the boring bills, but I had not seen it all lined up like a ledger. The family phone plan was in my name, and every month the charge hit my card automatically. The internet and streaming bundles were on my account too, and the power company statements came to my email, though my parents liked to tell people they handled the house expenses. Even the extra top-ups for the mortgage escrow, the ones that had kept the bank from slapping them with penalties, had quietly been mine, pulled from my overtime checks while my brother talked about how stressed he was from work. I scrolled through months of statements, screenshot after screenshot, and it was all there, me paying, them forgetting. I opened my email and searched order confirmation. That was when the second wave hit me. The living room couch had been financed under my credit. The washer and dryer, the mattress in the guest room, the television they bragged about buying on Black Friday, all carried invoices with my name on them. Even the coffee machine my mother claimed she picked up as a treat had been purchased with my rewards account, which is why it always spit out bonus coupons addressed to me. It was not generosity, it was paperwork. For a moment, I almost laughed because the irony was too sharp. My parents had told me money was tight when I asked for help with one small thing last year, a dental bill that my insurance did not cover, and I ended up putting it on a credit card. They said they could not spare it, yet here was proof that they had been sparing plenty, just not for me. The truth is that money was not tight, their generosity was selective, and I was not on the list. I did not scream or call them liars, because I realized that nothing I could say would land harder than the numbers themselves. So I made a plan. I opened a new folder on my desktop and started dragging every screenshot, every PDF, every email into it. I labeled it what I paid for. By the time I was done, the folder was so heavy with proof that it almost felt like a case file you could drop on a lawyer's desk. I was not making threats, though. I was just organizing reality. The more I looked, the clearer it became. This was not about whether they loved me or whether they loved him more. This was about leverage. I had been paying for the backbone of the household, and they had been acting as if it appeared out of thin air. I was the invisible sponsor of their lifestyle, the safety net that did not even get mentioned. That cruise, in a twisted way, was the best gift they could have given me, because it was the clean break I needed to see the whole picture. I decided I would not fight them with words when they came back. I would let the bills talk. I started drafting a calendar, slotting in calls to utility companies, noting cancellation dates, and arranging the switch-off points so they would all land right after the cruise. I wanted them to return to the exact world they had built without me. I knew it would sting, but it would sting with truth, not drama. That night, while they texted pictures of themselves shopping for cruise outfits, I quietly submitted the first transfer request to separate my phone number from the family plan. It was not dramatic, just a form online. I typed it in calmly, clicked confirm, and smiled when the confirmation email came through. It felt like unlocking the first piece of a door I had been holding closed with my bare hands. I told myself I would take it step by step, no big speeches, no shouting matches. Just clean, documented moves. Because at the end of the day, I was not punishing anyone. I was reclaiming what was already mine. And if they called that betrayal, then maybe betrayal was simply them seeing themselves without my subsidy. The truth is, I had been financing their comfort for years, and they had never once asked how tight my money felt. Now I was about to teach them, not with anger, not with guilt, but with silence and receipts. And as I checked off the first item on my new calendar, I knew this time the bill would land in their laps, not mine. Because I was done asking for fairness. From here on out, the numbers were going to speak louder than my voice ever had. And trust me, they were not ready for what those numbers had to say. If the first shock was realizing that I had been the quiet engine powering our family's comfort, then the second was how easy it became to stop pretending once I gave myself permission to treat the situation like a project rather than a plea for fairness. Because the minute I shifted from arguing in my head to outlining on paper, the fog lifted and the pattern turned into tasks that I could act on without asking anyone's approval. I started by building a simple ownership map in a spreadsheet that would make any auditor proud, laying out each category of expense and purchase with the kind of blunt labels that do not leave room for wishful thinking. So the phone plan showed my name as the account holder with the carrier's contract number. The internet service listed my authorization PIN and install ticket. The streaming apps carried my email login and the renewal dates. The power company statement showed my bank routing number and the autopay day. The furniture line items pulled from financing emails attached to my credit profile, and every single thing had a link to the original receipt so that I would not have to argue memory against memory when the time came. Then I took a trip to the big box store where I had set up a rewards account years ago because I thought points were harmless fun, and I asked the customer service desk for a purchase history printout tied to my phone number and email, and the associate, who had absolutely no idea what she was handing me, slid across the counter a thick stack of itemized receipts listing serial numbers, delivery addresses, dates, and last 4 digits of the card used, which meant that even the television my parents loved to call our Black Friday steal was sitting on a sheet of paper that said, in plain language, that I bought it, I scheduled its delivery, and I paid for the protection plan they bragged about to their friends. I photographed every serial number in the house, not to be dramatic, but to be disciplined, propping open drawers and turning appliances around so labels faced the camera, narrating the date and time on a quiet video as I moved through the rooms. Because I wanted to make sure that if anyone later pretended to forget who brought what into this house, the timestamps would do the remembering for them, and I saved it all to a cloud folder named exactly what it was, which made me laugh even as my stomach trembled a little at my own audacity. To make sure I was not crossing a line I could not defend, I called the non-emergency police number and asked to speak with someone about property ownership in shared residences, and the officer who called me back did not give legal advice, which he made very clear, but he did explain that documenting purchases, serials, and receipts, and removing only what is demonstrably yours while leaving a record of what you moved and when, is the difference between a messy family fight and an accusation. That goes nowhere, and while I hung up still a little shaky, I felt steadier because I had a path that did not require me to win a debate, only to follow directions. I rented a small storage unit under my name with a month-to-month plan that would not trap me, and I scheduled a couple of evening trips for the following week using a friend's SUV, choosing times when the street would be quiet and the neighbors would be busy. Not because I was hiding, but because I no longer wanted theatrics to be part of the story, and I made a checklist for each run so I would not leave with anything that was not mine or forget to photograph anything that was. Next came the account work, the boring calls that most people avoid because they drain your will to live, and I took them one by one. Setting firm but polite cancellation dates for services that lived entirely in my name and removing my card from any account that supported other users, but did not require me legally to carry them. While also creating a neutral cover sheet that explained in one page what would happen and when, so that on the day my parents returned, the internet would require a new account holder, the streaming would log out and prompt them to start their own plan, the power would continue under a transfer request that I had pre-filed with the utility once they called to accept responsibility, and the landline that no one used would, for the first time in years, stop ringing without anyone missing it. Because I had already ported my personal number off the family plan, I tightened that move by setting a security pin and locking the carrier profile so no one could casually slide my line back in under a group discount. And I watched the authorization requests roll in on my email over the next day as my mother tried to approve changes from overseas, and I declined them with a calm nod to my calendar, reminding myself that boundaries do not require apologies, just consistency. Throughout the week, as travel photos arrived with captions about sunsets and buffets and how much Kyle needed this reset, I kept building my quiet stack of proof and scheduling my small, non-dramatic exits. And every time I felt the old reflex to text a sarcastic reply or call them out, I chose instead to add another receipt to the folder or another line to the checklist, because I understood that the only way this would hold was if I refused to convert it into a shouting match that could be rewritten later as me being ungrateful, which I am sure is the story they would prefer. When the loyalty program emailed a coupon addressed to me for coffee pods, I laughed because the machine they called their treat was literally thanking me for my own purchase, and that little automated thank you, ridiculous as it was, pushed me through the last piece I had been putting off, which was the letter I planned to leave on the kitchen counter in a plain envelope with a copy in the cloud, explaining in neutral language that items removed matched receipts, that services canceled were in my name and would no longer be funded by me, and that any questions could be answered by the documents already provided, which meant the conversation would be with the facts rather than with me. By the time my calendar ticked into the final days of their trip, I had packed, labeled, and moved the things I could quietly and safely handle. I had lined up the service changes to trigger within hours of their landing. And I had set my new mailing address so that nothing further would reach the old house with my name on it, and while a part of me still ached for the version of family where a reasonable talk fixes everything, the rest of me knew that reasonable talks require reasonable listeners, and what I had instead were receipts that did not need anyone's permission to exist. So when another carrier email popped up asking me to approve a payment method change that would have pulled my card back into the group plan I had already left, I did the smallest and most satisfying thing I had done all week, which was to hit decline again, then set a hard account alert that blocked any new charges to my payment profiles without my explicit yes, and I sat back thinking that if they wanted phones and internet and all the comforts of home, they could open their own accounts like adults do, because the free ride had ended while they were watching the sea. And since the next step would not be a text or a rant, but the sound of a dead Wi-Fi router and a television that refused to log in, I closed my laptop, looked at my neatly stacked folder one last time, and smiled at the thought that for once, the house would speak louder than I ever could, which is exactly why, when the first frantic message landed, I already knew how I would answer it without raising my voice at all. What finally pushed me from planning to action was not a dramatic insult or some speech I could quote later. It was the simple realization that every extra day I left things as they were was another day I was financing a story that did not include me. So I woke up, opened my checklist, and decided that from this point forward I would move like a professional who knows her job, because I had already gathered the proof, scheduled the dates, and mapped the route to the storage unit, and all that remained was to follow the plan with the kind of calm that makes other people wonder whether they ever truly knew you. I started with the items that carried the cleanest paper trail, not because I feared a fight, but because I wanted zero confusion when I later sent the summary. So the living room couch that everyone called ours got flipped on its side while I read the last four of the financing account into my phone's camera. Then the washer and dryer slid onto a dolly after I filmed the cereal plates and the delivery confirmation email on my tablet. And the television came down only after I opened the protection plan document that showed my name, my card, and my signature, which meant that even if someone decided to get loud about community property or family gifts, the documents would shrug and point back to me in quiet little lines of text that do not care who wins an argument. I talked to the camera as I moved, not to be theatrical, but to create a plain record a board claims adjuster could follow, saying the date, the time, the room, the item, and the matching receipt number. And with every clip saved to the cloud, I felt my shoulders drop a little lower. Not from exhaustion, but from the unfamiliar lightness that shows up when you finally stop negotiating with people who are committed to pretending that the ground is not solid beneath everyone's feet, and because I knew how easily messy stories spread in families, I left what was not mine exactly where it had always been, a choice that would later make their accusations collapse under the weight of the empty spaces that matched my receipts one for one. The pantry took the longest because it felt petty even as it was perfectly fair, but the membership account history did not care about my feelings. It listed bulk purchases with dates and quantities and the same cheerful thank you points that had convinced me to keep funding snacks and staples for years. So I pulled the items that matched recent orders, set aside anything that had obviously been a joint grocery run paid in cash, and left a simple note on the counter that said, in the softest language I could manage, that items removed matched receipts stored in the shared folder and that nothing without proof had been touched, which meant that if anyone wanted to escalate, the paper would answer and I would not need to. Between trips to the storage unit, I handled the unglamorous digital side, closing out subscriptions and services with a patience I usually reserve for healthcare billing, and because I had planned the dates around their return. Each cancellation confirmation read like a countdown that only I could hear, so the streaming platforms cued their final day, the grocery auto-ship paused and then ended. The alarm monitoring flagged the account as closed pending a new owner. The lawn service canceled. The card on file with a polite goodbye that made me smile more than it should have, and the router, which I owned outright, slid into my tote with its little blinking lights going dark while I whispered to the empty room that silence can be a boundary too. At one point I looked up and realized hours had passed, and rather than crashing into guilt or nostalgia, I felt oddly steady, which surprised me until I admitted that I had expected to cry or rage and instead found myself narrating serial numbers into a phone like a field reporter, because the truth is that grief for a fake story is lighter than it looks once you finally put it down. And I think that is why the next part, the part where I left the envelope on the counter, felt less like a goodbye and more like a confirmation email from me to myself that said you have finished your part and you do not owe anyone more than the facts. Before locking the door, I did a slow final walkthrough, panning the camera wall to wall in each room so there would be no confusion later about what remained, pointing at the empty spaces where my purchases had been, and then at the items I had never paid for which were all untouched, because I wanted it on record that I had been careful and that I understood the difference between fairness and revenge, and after saving the video I set the keys on a small tray by the entry, took a still photo with a timestamp overlay, and sent it to the same cloud folder that already held the receipts, the calendar, and the officer's business card, which meant that any future shout of theft would have to shout at the documents too. On my way out I stopped by the neighbors, handed over a duplicate key with a short note about the time I left and the date my parents would return, and asked only that if anyone needed to check the house before then, he confirm with me by text. Not because I feared damage, but because I no longer trusted the old habit of letting other people define what happened here, and when he nodded with the kind of uncomplicated decency you wish family would learn, I felt the last little twist of anxiety. Unclench. The final act of the day was the smallest and, for me, the most satisfying. From the front seat of the SUV, parked a few blocks away where I could think, I opened my email, lined up the cancellation confirmations, drafted a short cover message that read like a handoff note rather than a fight, and scheduled it to send the morning their plane landed, because there are times when the kindest way to end a story is also the clearest. And if that kindness feels cold to people who love the old arrangement, that is a temperature they can warm with their own effort from now on. By the time I rolled the storage unit door down and clicked the lock, the sun had already set somewhere I could not see from that alley, and even though I do not do big symbolic endings, I did let myself breathe in the quiet for a long minute, since the next sound I was going to hear from my family would not be a thank you or an apology, but a series of frantic messages about a dead router, frozen logins, and a couch-shaped hole in a living room that suddenly matched the budget they had always claimed to have, which is why, when my phone buzzed and the first line appeared on the screen, I did not rush to answer, because Chapter 4 would not start with my voice at all. The first message came while I was standing in the entryway of my new place staring at a stack of flattened boxes and a coffee mug that did not match anything. A buzzing little bubble on my screen that said the television would not turn on and the Wi-Fi kept asking for a password that did not exist anymore, which I let sit for a breath long enough to notice that my hands were steady and my chest was not pounding. Because for once the emergency did not belong to me, and then the next bubble arrived, this time in the family thread in the kind of tone that pretends to be a question while already accusing, asking where the couch had gone and whether I had changed the streaming login as some kind of joke. So I opened the folder I had built for exactly this moment, copied a single link, and dropped it in the chat with one line that said everything moved or canceled matched receipts and contracts in my name, and that the documentation was already organized if they preferred fax over. Guesses. What followed was the kind of flood that used to pull me under, except this time I let it run past while I watched the typing dots chase each other like a storm on a weather map. My mother firing off a paragraph about respect and tradition, and how families do not nickel and dime each other. My father adding a softer, but no less pointed suggestion that I could have talked to them before doing anything so drastic. And my brother jumping in with a photo from the ship's gift shop as if a shot glass, with a city name on it, could function as evidence that he had needed joy while I apparently had chosen violence, which would have been funny if it were not so familiar. Rather than argue about tone or memory, I replied with a short and very calm note pointing to the cover sheet at the top of the folder, a one-page index that listed each service, the account owner, the payment method, the cancellation or transfer date, and the reference number for the call, and I reminded them, without apology and without baiting an argument, that I had funded these things for years, and that I was no longer doing it, which was not revenge or punishment, but a boundary and an audit result, and that if they wished to continue any service, they were welcome to open their own accounts like any other household with grown adults. My mother went loud the way she always does when numbers interrupt her version of events, moving quickly from shock to indignation to the word theft, which she typed with a kind of triumphant certainty, like she had found the magic key that would unlock my guilt. And because I had promised myself not to play courtroom in a group chat, I simply responded with the officer's business card I had placed in the folder weeks ago and a single line that said he could confirm that removing property purchased by me and documented in receipts and serial numbers was not the crime she was reaching for, and that if she did want to make it official, I would be happy to forward the same file to whichever desk received her call. There was a pause long enough to feel like a held breath, and then my father tried the middle path he loves, the one where he asks for understanding because he hates conflict more than he loves resolution. Writing that it had been a hard year and that sometimes kindness has to carry the day, which would have landed differently if his idea of kindness had not always been me footing the bill while they congratulated themselves on their values. So I told him, without cruelty and without a lecture, that kindness without honesty becomes exploitation, and that I was finished funding a story where my work was invisible and my needs were treated like inconvenience. And then I pinned the financial timeline screenshot to the top of the chat. A neat column of dates and amounts and account names that showed in a single glance who had been the wallet and who had been the audience. Relatives drifted in the way they do when gossip smells fresh, a cousin asking whether there had been a misunderstanding, an aunt offering prayer hands made out of punctuation, an uncle deciding this was his chance to talk about how the younger generation is selfish, while also confessing he thought the couch had always belonged to my parents, and instead of engaging any of that, I answered once more with a link and a brief invitation to read before they reacted, because if they wanted to form a chorus, they could at least warm up on the right sheet music. My brother tried humor that was not funny, asking whether I planned to invoice them for the years I had stayed under their roof, a line I could have shredded by listing the escrow top-ups, the repairs I paid for, the groceries that turned into his midnight snacks, and the subscription he used to stream games for hours while calling me frugal. Yet I chose a different angle, telling him I would send an itemized reconciliation if he truly wanted one, and that if the total came out in my favor I would accept repayment plans with reasonable terms, which he did not answer because bluster hates math. When the call finally came instead of a text, my phone lit up with my mother's name, and I let it ring through, not because I was afraid, but because I had learned that real conversations require two things she was not offering, which are respect and comprehension. And when the voicemail landed with tearful accusations about abandonment and how neighbors would talk about the empty living room, I exhaled, typed a measured reply reminding her that reputations cannot be built on other people's credit cards forever, and that the neighbor already had a note from me with the time I left and the reason why, which meant there would be no mysterious rumors to nurse, only the truth they would have to sit with. To end the exchange on my terms without scoring a point that would only inflame them, I scheduled a final message to arrive an hour later containing a simple step-by-step of what to do next, instructions as if I were a neutral customer service agent, advising them to call the utility to open a new account, to contact the internet provider and choose a plan, to sign up for streaming with their own email, and to pick up a basic router if they did not want to wait for a technician, and I added a single sentence that said I would not be available for troubleshooting, since I was no longer the household's unpaid support desk, which was not cruelty but closure. And, because every chapter in this story has needed a small act that carried both truth and sting, I finished by updating the group chat settings so that my pinned financial timeline could not be unpinned without my consent. A quiet digital plaque that would stare back at anyone who opened the thread and tried to rewrite the past, which is why, when another notification landed, this time not a text, but a formal subject line from a lawyer cousin asking whether we should get in front of this before it becomes a family scandal, I felt a calm I have never felt in that house, because the answer to whether we would get in front of it was already waiting in the next move I had lined up long before their plane touched down. By the time the first shock of their return had turned into a steady rhythm of angry messages, tearful accusations, and half-hearted negotiations, I already knew that the outcome had been decided weeks earlier when I stopped thinking of myself as the daughter who owed and started acting as the account holder who had simply been too patient. So the last episode of this story did not begin with a shouting match or an apology, but with the quiet confirmation that my life no longer revolved around their approval, because while they had been sipping wine in Santorini, I had been signing a lease across state lines, packing the last of my boxes into storage, and accepting a job transfer that would cut off the last excuses to drag me back into the same cycle of duty disguised as love. The first step after their chaotic return was to make sure they understood that this was not a bluff and not a tantrum, but a structural change that could not be reversed with guilt, and to do that I leaned entirely on the documents, forwarding the entire organized folder to them again along with the officer's earlier confirmation that the removals were clean, legal, and fully documented, and then, in a gesture that was half olive branch and half final dare, I offered them one compromise: if they wished to reimburse me for the documented amounts I had poured into the household, I would provide the key to the storage unit, and they could reclaim any items that were still technically shared, but had been listed under my accounts, which meant that they had a path to regain some control if they were willing to finally acknowledge what the numbers had always said. Their answer, unsurprisingly, was not cooperation but outrage, because accepting my offer would mean admitting that for years their comfort had come from my sacrifice, and so instead of negotiation I received more messages about family bonds and betrayal. The same recycled lines that had kept me on the hook for years, except this time they landed on a version of me who had already moved her mailing address, frozen her credit reports so no one could casually attach her name to anything, and switched every important password to accounts they did not even know existed, so their anger could not touch me beyond a few buzzing notifications that I muted with a swipe of my thumb. I did not stop there, because part of me wanted the closure to be more than just silence. I wanted it to be constructive in a way that even they could not frame as destruction. So I closed the family emergency checking account I had been secretly funding for years, the one they always bragged about having in case of disaster, even though I was the only one making deposits, and I took the balance, which was not enormous, but not insignificant either, and donated it to a scholarship fund in my grandmother's name, the one relative who had ever looked at me without asking what I could cover, and when the receipt came back in my inbox I forwarded it to my parents, with a short line that said this was the last time I would ever pay for silence, and that they were free to be loud about it if they wanted because the account no longer existed. My father's voice softened in the days that followed, a string of messages that tried to find common ground without truly offering accountability, asking whether we could meet for dinner, whether we could sit down and talk it through, whether I could see that he was caught in the middle, and I let them sit unanswered not because I wanted him to hurt, but because I finally understood that middle ground is only useful when both sides respect the boundary lines, and my mother's messages, still fiery and defensive, only reminded me of how many years I had tried to explain myself to someone who had no interest in listening. So instead of engaging, I simply read them, shook my head, and then turned back to unpacking in my new apartment where even the silence felt like wealth. On the night I hung my last shelf, I ordered cheap takeout, sat cross-legged on the floor with nothing but mismatched plates and a sense of strange peace, and thought about how much of my adult life had been consumed by trying to earn approval that was never actually for sale, and how liberating it felt to finally cut the transaction off at its root, because without me as the silent sponsor, the entire structure they had built around favoritism and selective generosity collapsed into its actual shape, and for once they had to live in the house they could afford rather than the one I had been subsidizing. The messages have slowed since then, tapering into occasional bursts that remind me they are still circling the wreckage of their story. But the truth is that the real ending happened the moment I realized I did not need them to understand me in order for my choice to be valid, because justice in this case was not about a court ruling or a family reconciliation. It was about reclaiming the hours, the paychecks, the credit lines, and the sanity I had been giving away for nothing more than the privilege of being ignored, and once you see that clearly you cannot unsee it. So yes, they came back to an empty living room, to a dead Wi-Fi router, to a streaming account that logged them out forever, and to a group chat pinned with a timeline of dates and amounts that made their denial impossible, but I came back to myself. To a version of me that no longer confused sacrifice with loyalty or silence with peace, and that is why when people ask whether I regret how far I went, whether I wish I had handled it more gently, I only say that I regret not doing it sooner. Because nothing is heavier than carrying a family that never notices the weight until you finally set it down. And if there is one last truth to end this story on, it is that I did not leave them with nothing, because I left them with the facts they had spent years pretending not to see, and I left them with the bill that had always been mine but now belonged squarely to them. And whether they pay it with money, or pride, or silence, that part is no longer my problem, which is the most satisfying victory I could ever have written for myself.